Americas. These include the practice of nonviolence, responses to racism, sustainability of life through the fundamental right to water, and embracing concerns for women and standing in solidarity with immigrants. We are extremely proud, therefore, to debut the Pell Center's program in Washington, D.C., in collaboration with the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars through the symposium Future Shock, How Environmental Change and Human Impact Are Changing the Global Map. On behalf of Sister Therese and my colleagues at the Pell Center and Salve Regina University, I'd like to thank His Serene Highness Hereditary Prince Alois and Ambassador Claudia Fritzsche and the Embassy of the Principality of Liechtenstein for their continued encouragement and support as we cultivate awareness of the issues that both Senator Pell and the Sisters of Mercy hold dear. We are also grateful to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars for hosting this symposium and further perpetuating our goals. Just as the Wilson Center strives to bridge the gap between the world of ideas and the world of policy, the Pell Center is committed to exploring issues of international peace and justice. Again, welcome.
Dean mentioned the 5 topic areas that we've boiled down. Quite frankly, to be honest, we're talking about security, globalization, multilateral arts, humanities, and education. If you ever want to find out, this is the young building where the Pell Center is housed. It's also a student dormitory, by the way. If you ever want to find out about our programs, what's going on, what we have in the future, what we've done in the past, including our publications, all you have to really do is Google Pell Center. It is extraordinary, if I can say that, honor the Pell legacy. There's almost no area that matters to us in the world that Senator Pell didn't touch in his career. Let me just say one final thing. Last Monday, I'd read at the Redwood Library, the oldest operating library in the United States, with the chairman of the NEA, read my own poetry alongside Dana Gioia. Senator Pell was the sponsor for the founding legislation for the National Endowment for the Arts, National Endowment for the Humanities. So I'm particularly privileged of being a poet and a novelist who happens to deal in security and policy issues as well. So here's how we're starting off with the first presentation, how demographics and migration are changing the global map. All of these presentations necessarily so are a broad brushstroke, but I hope they're a useful one. As soon as we turn out the lights, fortunately I think most of us know this slide. It was made a composite over a number of years by 254 defense meteorological satellite platforms. But it tells us a lot about the world, but one is the haves versus the wants, energy abuse and release, since one could make that argument. But it is also, I think, a very important thing to recall that if you look at the United States of America, 4.5% of the world's population, 28% of the world's gross domestic product, and 25% of the world's energy consumption. As the world moves forwards, progresses, etc., it would actually take 6 planet Earths to match the consumption patterns of the people in the United States. So there's a significant footprint right there. We talk about the rapid change of demographics. Each dot on this image, these images represents 1 million people. We can see the Mediterranean and East Asia around the time of the birth of Christ. It took actually 1,350 years for that population to double. 1700, we can see South Asia, East Asia, and indeed Europe starting to emerge as the dominant, and West Africa as the dominant themes. Advent of the Industrial Revolution, of course, can sustain a greater population. And then we come to 1900, 1.6 billion people, the average average American citizen, male, 47 years of age. Today it's about 78 to 79. And there's other rapid demographic shifts that have occurred. Cutting out of 1950, post-World War II, to the year 2000 is the largest demographic population growth in history, even though the particular fertility rates may not have been as high. You can see some significant changes occurring all the way up to 1985 and projections as high as 2020. Now, having spent a good bit of time in the Siberian and Central Asian steppe, and we know that the Sahel is actually reaching out and people are not moving to Sahara or into the Andean Ridge. There's just no more place to put those dots. And although certainly the UN Population Division has shifted in its estimates, which is the right thing to do, the 1998 revision does suggest in a very simple graphic that, in fact, the majority of population growth that is occurring demographically is in the emerging world. That's significant. Not the best graphic in terms of visibility, but it does point out a very interesting thing. The United States, the so-called, whatever it means, developed states, does remain demographically exceptionalist, but we see a completely different dynamic emerging with India to become the most populous state. But if you break it down a bit, if you look at Pakistan and Bangladesh, which was East Pakistan until 1971, their populations combined in 2050 exceeds the population of the United States of America. In fact, roughly after the turn of the century, Pakistan exceeded its population that of the Russian Federation, which is rapidly declining. 1040 window. Human geographers use it. It was actually a term first used by Christian evangelicals. 57 states, essentially, between 10 degrees north latitude and 40 degrees north latitude. These are the states that had the greatest socioeconomic challenges, 2/3 of the world population, 82% of the world's poor. It's also a portion of the world, for all sorts of reasons, not just resources, but human security challenges, that we may not wish to be involved with in terms of our national interest or security, but in terms of our national interest and security, we cannot withdraw from this 1040 in the future. So I use the term entangled vulnerabilities because anything we talk about, whether it's demographics or youth bulges, which is a dangerous term, by the way, we could talk about later, are all interconnected with disease, climate change, rapid urbanization, depletion of resources, decline in food production access and availability, soil erosion desertification, megacities, and the lack of viable warning systems, although I would say to the U.S. intelligence community's credit, the use of the Argos system to track and as a projection for disease outbreaks is actually a very helpful warning system being put into place. My argument is all these vulnerabilities, not direct threats, are interwoven, they're complex linkages, interdependent, and system chaotic. It's not pretty. I'll give you one example and a few images. Lagos will be that focus feature, but Nigeria itself, in the space of a century, will grow by about 12 times, and more significantly in terms of urbanization, we'll see a significant factor moving towards urbanization. It's also significant in terms of the density factors that you can see the denser population, which is also the location of the major oil fields where there have been any number of backlashes. Lagos itself, as recently in 1990, was not among the world's largest cities. In 2005, it was the 15th largest in the world. In 9 years, it may be as close as the 3rd largest city in the world. Population density estimated at that greater than New York City, writ large. In the Lagos slum, police rarely enter. Life expectancy is under 40. There's no doctors, no clinics. Raw sewage is dumped in the same place where fishing is the main industry. Let me say 24 November 2007, the district of Debelle, 2 youths slam into a police car and sets off yet another round of threshold, or I don't like the term, but it's common, trigger violence. And the outcome in the space of a few days was horrifying. It was actually more aggressive than the previous incident of 2005 in terms of the response. We move a bit closer to a place that's near and dear to my heart is the elections and the aftermath, moving out in networks of violence in some ways from Nairobi, both to Mombasa and to the Rift Valley. We look specifically at Karenjet. You can't see it necessarily in this picture, but those are Kalenjin of tribal affiliation carrying machetes and hatchets, carrying mobile phones with mud-caked faces, going house to house. And one of the true tragedies of democracy and violence, that what it says in that young man's forehead in the morgue is post-elections violence. At the same time, police reactions against viable opposition protests or democratic outpours was not pleasant. The reason why this gentleman is using the figure of a rake is because that's exactly what happened to him. He was attacked with a garden hoe. A true image, yes, it's clearly staged, but is the notion of a cultural of violence, both through the panga and the collaring with a rubber tire. It's also the tragedy of, yes, we've reached an agreement, let's hope it lasts, but it also uncovers all these tensions being brought to the surface, not just one factor. Remember, we're talking about vulnerabilities. Outside Kibera being blocked from entering into the stage of protest, and the final image of no Raila, no peace. So I want to give you an example of some pressure points. Now, this is a reverse image map. It's almost like a breathing organ. Take a look at the population versus the energy consumption versus HIV/AIDS rates versus child mortality versus total spending on health care. Now, perhaps rightly so, there are all sorts of attacks on Robert Kaplan's 1994 Coming Anarchy. But I do think that map shows something. We are entering a bifurcated world. Part of the globe is inhabited by Hegel's and Fukuyama's last men, healthy, well-fed, and pampered by technology. The other, larger part is inhabited by Hobbes' first men, condemned to a life that is nasty, brutish, and short. Although both parts will be threatened by environmental stress, the last man will be able to master it. The first man will not. Another more brutal way of saying this is some cities are littered with garbage. Lagos is littered with corpses. We are indeed entering the urban century, a place we've really never been before in human history. Today, over 50% lives in cities. By 2030, we'll be approaching 2 out of 3. 90% again occurs in these emerging world cities. 1 in 6 lives with an unhealthy air quality, 1 in 50 is inadequate sanitation, 1 in 30 does not have access to safe water. 1950, you'll see the chart at the bottom, it's 1950, 2000 estimate, 2015 projection. There was only in 1950 one megacity population of 10 million or more, that was New York City, although London was indeed approaching it. We can see the rapid changes in South America. We can see, indeed, Tokyo will remain the world's largest megacity, 35.1 million in 2015, but yet it can handle its infrastructure. Those that experience rapid choice, such as Lagos, growing by a factor of almost 25, or Karachi by 21, and my all-time favorite example in the most ecologically fragile section of the world, in the Bay of Bengal, is the capital of Bangladesh, growing from 400,000 to 22.8 million in the space of 65 years. Now, if you take the United States of America, New York City, that one megacity is 1950, at a population of 12 million. Its population in 2015 would be 684 million people, twice the current population in some of the United States of America. How could we possibly think that the capital of one of the poorer states on the face of the earth could survive that in isolation? There were 7 cities with 5 million or more in 1950. There will be 58 in 2015. Recall, these are in the 1040 window. China is experiencing the greatest internal human migration in history. 90 cities with over 1 million population. My favorite example, the techno city of Shenzhen did not exist prior to 1979, and not until 20 years ago was it really significant. Today it's a population of 13 million people. It's important just in this image, this is Sao Paulo. There's 240 heliports in Sao Paulo, there's 10 in Manhattan. So maybe Karl Marx was right. It's not just class stratification, it's altitude stratification. You actually fly above the chaos. These are leading on the roads out to Soweto, the poison mining pits. Off in the distance, you can see the skyline of Nairobi. This is Kibera, the largest slum. If you take the camera and move it down, this is a daily living condition. The favelas of Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, but yet you swing it around and you look at this beautiful city in Guevara Peak. So in terms of what is happening, more developed countries, that advanced population migration is inevitably a factor to alleviate some of these aging populations, but those that are under environmental stress will suffer more. Infectious disease, more likely to outbreak. So there really are some huge challenges. And let me, moving towards conclusion, Let me end with a positive example, since some of this has been a bit bleak. The U.S. is the world's most prosperous nation state, with the largest population explosion in history, growing by a factor of over 75 times. That is not to say that it is impossible, but it is to say that this all requires strategic planning, strategic intention, and strategic investment. One of my favorite quotes by Abba Eban: "Men and nations behave wisely once they have exhausted all the other alternatives." Thank you so much.
Well, I'm attempting to deliver Dr. Butz's presentation for him. I'll do my own.
With correction.
We could trade and make it particularly interesting for all of you. Well, welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Geoff Dabelko, and it's my privilege to be collaborating with the Pell Center and to be hosting today's event on behalf of former Congressman Lee Hamilton, who's our president director. It's a real privilege to see Mrs. Pell here and to work with our friend Peter Liotta in the Pell Center. It's been tremendous, and we appreciate you all coming to hear what the four of us have to say on related but different topics. And I'm going to, in some ways, pick up just one of the bullet points of Peter's and focusing on the water issues, building on some of the assumptions of the world that Peter has laid out, and try to, in some ways, have a particularly positive story, even in the face of some real challenges, and pose it as a question: water wars or water woes. Water management is conflict management. We have seen these statistics before, but it never ceases to kind of shock me in terms of when we're looking at water and understanding what, in terms of we think about the water that we can use, it's really just a tiny fraction of the world's water. So 97% of the world's water is salt water, essentially, the oceans, right? Of the remaining 3%, most of that, almost 100% of that's locked up in ice, mostly at the poles. And so really, when we're talking about accessible fresh water focused on human needs, we're really talking about just a fraction. And that, well, this is going to be hard unless those of you, there's some young people here with good eyes still, but it's, this is to give you a sense. In sub-Saharan Africa, the dark blue lines are water per capita availability in sub-Saharan Africa in 1990. The light blue lines are 2025 predictions. Oh, no, sorry, reverse that. So the light blue is what it is now, or what it was in 1990, excuse me. The dark blue, it kind of moving down and showing lower and lower levels of water availability per capita in sub-Saharan Africa. So all countries in a state of water vulnerability, many in stress, and about 10 or so in absolute scarcity per capita. To give you a picture of the challenge, particularly for sub-Saharan Africa in terms of water. Peter alluded to some of these figures, but right now we know that we have 1.2 billion people without access to clean water, 2.6 billion without access to adequate sanitation. And adequate sanitation, I must say, is a fairly low bar, nothing that we're kind of used to here in the United States. The results, among many results, and this I would say is probably a conservative estimate of at least 2.2 million deaths, mostly children under 5, mostly dying from diarrhea, something in many ways completely preventable. We know how to deal with it, but we don't deal with it. And it proves to be a real challenge. And in part, you will hear a number of human security frames here, and understanding what it is that's actually killing people. It doesn't always have to be at the end of the gun for us to care in this broader security term. And I think this figure illustrates that. So as a result, though, of particularly those scarcity graphics, we hear this frame of water wars are coming. Countries are going to fight over water based on these scarcities. And we see it in our newspapers every time. This is a favorite reframe of newspaper headline writers. Not always the journalists, but the headline writers, even if it's a kind of a considered story, will blow it up in this context. And then also our politicians. Notably, often Egyptian politicians, because the Nile River in Egypt, of course, sits downstream of the Nile, and there's great concern, and understandable concern given the dependency of Egypt on the rivers or the waters of the Nile. But there's a common refrain from senior politicians. You can see it kind of even continuing today, that really the kind of whether water is going to be the next source of war in the Middle East is the common refrain and such, but it's really framed as we have them now and they certainly are coming. Just look at the scarcity figures. I would suggest that there's a lot of logic, even not just those per capita figures, but we have 263 rivers that are shared by 2 or more countries. So our water systems are highly interdependent between countries. This is a map of the Nile Basin, and in many ways the Nile is the poster child for this argument, based on the fact that particularly Ethiopian highlands are the source of so much of the water, terribly poor country, lots of potential for hydro power and development, and the Egyptians essentially historically putting the kibosh on that because they're the stronger military power. So the question is this kind of future as evidence something that we should kind of accept on face value? And I would suggest that we shouldn't. The Nile Basin Initiative is an effort that's been formalized since 1999, was going on before, but under World Bank and UN Development Program facilitation, you had all 10 countries coming together at very senior levels, continuing to, in the Nile Basin, and talking about developing a shared vision, which they've done, and transitioning from a rights to water to a needs to water to sharing benefits. So it's taking, in some ways, starting by taking the political borders off the map, figuring out the irrigation needs, the energy needs, the ecosystem needs, the household needs, and trying to figure out the optimal utilization of water within a development frame to try to address the poverty across the basin and to be able to trade some of those benefits across borders when it makes sense. All of this is framed in a development context. None of this is framed necessarily in a conflict prevention context, but I would make the case in part because of that water wars frame and the high politics of water in the region. That's exactly what it is, even though it's frankly tactically useful not to frame it in those contexts, but put it in the development context. But we should, of course, say one case does not an argument make. And so to step back to the data, this is work that many of you will be familiar with. Aaron Woolf and colleagues, a geographer at Oregon State University, to my mind, the kind of go-to person on analyzing conflict and cooperation between countries over water. And Aaron and his colleagues took over 1,800 examples of interactions between states and coded them from most conflictual, down at the bottom with formal war, to most cooperative, the formally signing an international water treaty. I think what's interesting, we see a big red line there around verbal hostility. The politicians are really willing to rattle the sabers, but it in fact doesn't and only rarely results in formal, intentional use of force between countries over the issue of water. In the military acts, I think 27 of those 37 are the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and so one case overrepresents the ones where we see the most conflict. What we do see is a lot of cooperation, a lot of it, again, verbal, where there's a fairly low threshold. But we do see a trend that may be slowing down, but a trend in the last 20 to 30 years of increased cooperation around basins, in part because of the interdependencies around water. And so you're starting to see part of my argument, which is if we frame our water difficulties just in the most dramatic in terms of water wars, we're going to miss some of these opportunities for cooperation and garnering some of these joint development outcomes that are really hopefully ultimately benefiting people on the ground. That said, I don't want to paint such a rosy picture as to suggest there's not a lot of conflict around water. I think for the most part we've just been looking at the wrong levels between states. There's an awful lot of conflict below states and more local levels. So one that we're most familiar with, certainly have plenty of examples in this country, some of which are incidentally violent, not necessarily organized violent, but so between sectors. So this is kind of agriculture versus urban use, and certainly if you're from the Southwest or from California, you have lots of stories to tell about this. Something that's in the news now, again, not to suggest, as some I think have wrongly suggested, that, well, Darfur is a climate change problem or Darfur is a water conflict. Well, there are all sorts of things that go into a crisis and a tragedy such as Darfur, and obviously a conflict entrepreneurial regime in Khartoum exploiting this issue is first and foremost. But I would say that on some of these issues we can't understand the full picture, especially if we're going to try to fundamentally address it unless we understand some of the underlying issues, one of which are some of the demographics that Peter talked about, but also in this case the notion that there have been fundamental changes from the water connection in terms of rainfall, so dropped 30% over the last 50 years in this region. So long and sustained droughts. The predictions in terms of climate change really largely based on declining availability of water, really meaning that foodstuff production in these areas are going to be bad. And then also just the loss of arable land because of the process of desertification. So one can ultimately then really exacerbating what we've had historically in terms of the fights between the pastoralists and the agriculturalists. Two different ways of making a living, but really then exacerbating and coming to a head, especially when someone's willing to exploit it for their own purposes, as the government in Khartoum is so willing to do. Another, certainly privatization and access. We'll hear a lot about this. There'll be a movie entitled, notably, Water Wars, even though it's about domestic privatization of water. This is a picture from Cochabamba, Bolivia, where, again, only one person died at the end of the gun, which, of course, for that one person is terrifically tragic. But it was a protest that largely around the privatization of the water and the delivery of services in the city of Cochabamba that led to widespread protests that then became protests about a lot of things, including the water, that brought down two successive governments in Bolivia. So high politics, even though it's not necessarily classic security in the definition of engagement of organized violence, but nevertheless very high politics for those people and big implications for government. Dams, of course. This is Three Gorges, which is in China we hear so much about. But I believe it was the 2000 World Commission on Dams report looked at large dams in the, I think it was since 1935, that estimated 40 to 80 million people, well, that's a big gap, but 40 to 80 million people were displaced by large dam infrastructure. So again, not people necessarily, not kind of conflict in the classic sense, but particularly when one factors in some fairly high levels of corruption and the inability for relocation, tremendously disruptive in terms of people's lives and welfare. And so, again, if we only frame the water crisis in this kind of water wars, we, A, are not tied to the evidence, and B, are missing a lot of what is important around conflict management around water. And so to end on a more positive note, is to, in some ways, say, well, what is happening about that top part of Aaron Wolf's graph in terms of cooperation? Is there something, I mean, that cooperation is not just happening on its own. It's taking a lot of effort. It's taking a lot of dialogue facilitation. It's also taking a lot of insight on the part of practitioners at multiple levels, civil society as well as government, to build on and recognize interdependencies around water. So how can we do that more proactively to break these links between water and conflict, even if we're focusing at subnational levels? And I think we see some examples water playing very different roles, sometimes in active conflicts. So you had literally Jordanians and Israelis meeting throughout their period of conflict to manage water, called picnic table talks in part because they met at a picnic table in the border area. And in this sense, water, because of the various interdependencies, serving as a lifeline for dialogue when things are poor in other parts of the relationship. So the other parts of the relationship should be highly conflictual, but in part because of our dependency on water, and in some ways in our inability to control it ourselves, kind of go and take it and bring it home with us, we have this dynamic where we see parties who are cooperating around it and providing this. Good water makes good neighbors is also an example drawn from this region where very local, I mean school to school and town to town relationships develop between Israelis and Palestinians, Jordanians and Israelis, largely around the interdependence on sanitation. So the lack of treatment of sanitation on the Palestinian side having negative health implications on the Israeli side, bringing those parties together that allow them, based on that interdependence, to go together and lobby at national levels and international levels, testify here up in the Hill in terms of influencing the foreign assistance debates in this country. Nile Basin Initiative I mentioned as early on as one kind of example in this realm. The other, in terms of, okay, well, yeah, that's great, lifeline, but it's not really to the core of the issue. Water's still going to be a peripheral issue. To that I would say, listen, consistent with the notion that water is not what countries initially start fighting about. I would say that can be true, and at the same time, water can be absolutely critical to ending the conflict. So whether it's India, Pakistan, Palestine, Israel, it's not what's instigated the conflict, but you better believe you have to go through water to get out of the conflict. So in both of those situations, you have water as the focus of the negotiations to come out of it. So it doesn't get you into the problem, but you got to go through it to get out of the conflict, any sort of sustainable peace. And just finally to end with a photo that kind of looks like, well, maybe not a vacation photo in that it's in front of a blown-up armored personnel carrier, but this is an Angolan former colonel and a South African former colonel, both of whom now are in the Angolan side working in government in the water ministry, and the South African Tony Turton side working as a hydrologist and geographer in front of the Okavango River, a place if you know that part of kind of Angola, Namibia, and Botswana, part of southern Africa, that during the apartheid era was the site of a lot of fighting, including these two gentlemen fighting on opposite sides. In part because of their experiences, they recognized the criticality of water to the development and to avoiding going back to some of those days in terms of they saw the potential for fighting over water, but also the ability for these issues to come together, and have both been engaged, as have including our government in supporting some of the negotiations in this basin, a basin that we don't hear a lot about and has none of the kind of gets none of the headlines that something like the Nile does, but nevertheless is one where we've seen conflict in the region, we've seen water be a strategic asset in it, but we're also seeing it be part of the building blocks of this region of the world coming out of a really rough period in that apartheid era, and finding ways to come together on water. So trying to see the positive side of the interdependencies rather than the negative vulnerabilities. So I'll stop there and thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Pell Centre, and particularly Mrs. Pell, for inviting me here, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all. I'm going to talk about poverty and environment links in Africa. I manage a joint UNDP-UNEP poverty and environment program in Africa, and what I want to talk about is how environment, defined in the broader sense to mean natural resources like land, fisheries, water, is linked to poverty, and ultimately how it can contribute to instability and insecurity. This is what are poverty and environment links? What do they mean on the ground where people live? This is a canal in Bamako in Mali. It's grossly polluted. It stinks. There's clouds of mosquitoes so thick you can hardly walk through them. And these people live in a village next to that water, and that is their only source of water. They use it for cooking, cleaning, washing, clothes, their children. So their sickness rates from malaria, waterborne diseases are really high, and they can't afford to do anything about it. They can't afford the medicine, they can't afford the hospital treatment, so their children get sick and die. This is a hillside in Rwanda. Rwanda is an extremely steep country. If you look at that, this steep farmland, there's no real terracing. Every time it rains, the soil just washes down the hill, gets washed down these rivers, lows soil fertility, lows agricultural production, and fills up hydroelectric reservoirs with silt, so they generate less electricity. This is from the post-election violence in Kenya, and ultimately conflict over environmental resources, which are exacerbated by degradation and bad management. They don't necessarily spark violence, but it can be an underlying issue that provokes or prolongs. And this is what happened in Kenya, because competition over land is a big issue. So what does unsustainable use of the environment cost? It costs in terms of health, waterborne diseases. It kills people. Waterborne diseases again. Soil erosion reduces agricultural productivity, and in most countries in Africa, agriculture is the single largest part of the economy. So year by year, soil erosion causes reduction in food production. So it reduces income. And then ultimately, as people compete for ever declining environmental resources, there's tension, there's competition. Competition over land in Rwanda was really part of the problem. It helped spark it. In Kenya, there's competition over land because there's not enough water, there's not enough grass, there's not enough trees. So people get out their bows and arrows and their AK-47s and they fight over water points. So it contributes to insecurity. These are just some examples of how environmental unsustainability kills millions and costs billions. As was pointed out before, about 2.2 million people in developing countries, mainly children, die every year from waterborne diseases. At one time, it's estimated that half of the total number of hospital beds in developing countries are occupied by people suffering from waterborne diseases. Now, if you've got 2.2 million people dying every year, and there's probably nearly, I think it's the figures about 1.2 billion people get sick every year, and you multiply that by $5 to $10 that it takes to treat people and fix them, depending on the severity of the disease, this is billions of dollars. Respiratory diseases caused by indoor smoke from solid fuels killed an estimated 1.6 million people annually. Urban air pollution kills about 800,000 people annually. So some of these links, to give you specific examples of how environmental unsustainability, land and water use and poverty are linked. If you overgraze, you get reduced grass growth, more soil degradation and erosion, decreased livestock numbers, decreased production, decreased incomes. With water pollution, you can't use the water, people get sick, people die. If you deplete water, then you have similar production problems. You can't grow as many crops, so your people go hungry or they lose income. Deforestation, similar problems. Erosion, sedimentation, the soil washes down the hills into the hydroelectric reservoirs. In Rwanda, we've calculated that how many megawatt hours per year are not produced now because the hydro lakes are filling up with silt, and it costs about $65,000 a week in terms of imported diesel, petrol and generators. Fisheries, very good example. Decreased fishing catches cause decreased income. People have no work, no food. So in summary then, unsustainable use of the environment reduces the social and economic benefits produced by the environment. So people get sick and die, farmers grow less and earn less. In other words, development is hindered over time by environmental damage. And this contribution of the environment to social and economic development is often poorly understood. And this means that environmental sustainability, it's not a policy priority. People tend to think of the environment as, birds and bees and fishes that we have to look after because they're nice and all that sort of thing. But environmental resources are the essence of development. If people don't have enough land, if they don't have enough water in developing countries, then the countries won't develop, because 80-90% of the population depends on these environmental resources. We in the rich countries, what is the link to us with a prairie in the Midwest that grows wheat? We need it for our bread. But if production declines, we're not going to go hungry. In these countries, if the environment is damaged, people suffer. And when people suffer, tensions rise, and it can lead to a whole world of worse problems. And so that's why in UNDP and UNEP we have this program where we work with economists and planners in the Ministries of Planning and Finance to convince them that environmental sustainability should be a priority. Because if they don't look after the environment, over time production falls, so incomes fall, so the country will find it harder to develop. So we work to try and get environment as part of the Ministry of Finance priority, as the Ministry of Planning priority, as the Minister of Agriculture priority. Because it's in these other sectors that the key decisions are taken that impact on the environment. The Ministries of Environment are almost powerless in most countries. So we need to convince the Minister of Agriculture, the Minister of Finance, that planning, that environment matters. And here we have a well-known slide that shows all the links between things like environmental scarcity and violence. And if we look at this in the context of what's happened in Kenya, in the environmental scarcity, we have tremendous competition over land. If we go to the social segmentation of weakened institutions, we have poor democratic institutions, poor government structures, and then when you get a trigger like the election violence, everything comes together to create a terrible mess. So these are some examples of poverty and environment security linkages. We have competition for land in Kenya, armed clashes over scarce water and pasture in Darfur, but also Kenya, transboundary waters, climate change, in general competition over increasingly scarce natural resources. We have negative impacts on one party by the other. Water pollution makes people downstream ill. We have a lack of alternatives. If you're rich, you can buy an alternative. If you're poor, you don't have an alternative, and that's what helps lead to tension. So this is one reason why UNEP and UNDP are very happy to be working with the Pell Centre. UNEP and the Pell Centre are collaborating partners. We recognise the need to highlight the links between poverty and environment and security. We also need to develop and promote multilateral solutions, and support for this from key governments is vital. The US government is critical here. And I'd like to highlight the very positive role taken by the US government in helping to resolve the situation in Kenya. It's been vital to reaching the agreement. And I think that Senator Pell, he's a strong supporter of the multilateral system, but not an uncritical one. So I'd ask that we have support, but critical support for the UN. We know in the UN we have to improve, but like all good bureaucrats, we respond to positive economic incentives. So the US is using, like the British government and the Irish government doing, is saying, you show us you're working together better. You show us we're making a difference on the ground, and we'll give you increased resources. It's a very useful model. So what we want to do with the Pell Centre from now on is work on practical ways of how we can integrate environment, economic, security linkages at our country level work, because as that Homer-Dixon model showed and some of the other presenters have made clear, there's a huge, everything's like this. And if you don't get the interlinkages understood, and if you don't reflect them in your policy solutions, you're not going to go anywhere. I'm an economist, and economists always come up with dismal things. And there's a thing called the theory of the second best, which succinctly is that if you get one part of a big picture wrong, you can actually make the big picture worse. So you've got to get everything right. Thank you.
I'm honored to be here today to work with the Pell Center and the Embassy of Liechtenstein and our friends here at the Woodrow Wilson Center with whom we've done so much over the years. Mrs. Pell, it's grand to see you in the audience, and I know that the interest that you and the Senator have put into this sort of thing over the years has had a demonstrable effect. And when I see the team that we have here today addressing these issues, I'm buoyed because there's a change in the wind. If you follow what's going on at Department of Defense, you see that we actually have a new regulation, DoD 3000.05, that looks at stability operations and demands that the military be nation-building competent as well as combat ready. So there's this balance of roles that recognizes the importance of stability in addressing environmental security types of issues in maintaining governments in power, maintaining legitimacy, and satisfying those human security needs. So it's an opportunity for me today to speak to the issue of how you might use the military element of power to affect change and improve human security and improve stability around the world. I know in the early 1990s there was great reluctance to see the military involved in doing environment and security for various reasons. We would sit in the castle at the old Wilson Center and people would say, well, we have this new concept of environment and security. Environmentalists were against it because we don't want the impure military involved, and they've done so much to harm the environment. Other agencies didn't want to see the military involved because the military's force structure, if it was reduced, it provided resources. If they had a justification to do environmental things, then maybe they'd maintain force structure and there wouldn't be resources for other agencies. There were so many good reasons, not the least of which was the military wanted to maintain the tip of the spear. If we're doing the war on drugs, if we're doing these environmental issues, if we're helping with issues that could be addressed by other agencies, then how can we be combat ready? Because no one else can fight wars while other agencies can address these human security destabilizing needs. And we found, though, by the end of 2000, that we had had requests from the combatant commanders, and the world is divided up into these military organizations that maintain a military presence, for environmental security annexes for the Pacific Command, for the Southern Command, even now the Africa Command, from the Central Command, and that they had used the environment and security as outreach vehicles for their regions to build a positive role for their military, so they weren't always involved in issues that could be seen as repressive, or even if you had a regime, for instance, under the Marcos regime, where they had a bad record in the military for abusing human rights, there was a way to change and turn things around. So ever so briefly, I'd like to go through these. I don't want to say it all began with, but certainly when NATO recognized in its 1991 new strategy that it wanted to move away from traditional force-on-force issues, it recognized the fact that we have other variables, in fact, really the variables that constitute sustainable development, that were going to determine stability and security in the future, and that NATO needed to be able to address those. And later on, in '94, we had the Human Development Report come out of the UN that articulated the importance of environmental security to human security. It allowed people to determine if we have an end state of stability and human beings reaching their potential, then what are concepts for achieving that, and then what are the resources for achieving it? So our national security strategy began in the late 80s to address environment and security. Goldwater-Nichols Act mandated that the president each year determine what was the U.S. strategy to preserve America as we have known it. And so in the latest national security strategies in the Bush administration, defense, diplomacy, and development have all figured mightily into trying to achieve those end states. Here was a quote I thought was very important to show from President Reagan when he was our president, in his national security strategy to stress the importance of the environment to U.S. national security interests. It's easy to disregard that and portray the environment as something that's not a hard security issue, as something that perhaps the right doesn't embrace the way that the left does, and I wanted to show that that's not necessarily the case. Visionary people recognize its importance. So to achieve the end state, the United States typically uses its 4 elements of national power. Certainly how we teach it at the War College to senior leaders who are going to go out and wear 4 stars and try to maintain our interests around the world. Economic, diplomatic, informational, and the military. People typically dedicate one resource to a given problem instead of saying, how might all 4 of these be used with synergy and synchronized to give us the best effect? So the national security strategy gives rise to each agency's effort to contribute to achieving the objectives of the national security strategy. So the United States military develops a national military strategy, national defense strategy, the quadrennial defense review that lay out how environmental issues, and they do, affect security around the world. And then it's up to the theater security cooperation plan as managed by that 4-star. Think General Schwarzkopf in the First War, or General Abizaid in Iraq too. How do they use this issue to promote goodwill or to head off conflict? So our national security issues have been portrayed in the national security strategy over the year. Quote in the middle that it's contributing to political conflict came from President Bush the first. And the idea of using the environment to shape international affairs came out during the Clinton administration, where Secretary Perry spoke of preparing, responding, but let us also shape the security environment. Let us be proactive so that we don't necessarily have to put 20,000 combat troops in the Horn of Africa to distribute food. Perhaps if we had addressed the environmental security issues ahead of time, it would be more cost effective. And so what are some of those issues that threaten U.S. national security and human security around the world? And it's important to look at both sides because soft security issues don't resonate with all Americans the way hard security issues do. And by understanding the dimensions of both sides of the debate, it allows you to get the audience fully cognizant of the interrelationship of the two. These are difficult issues if they occurred in the United States. When they occur in developing countries, how will you solve those without the military? Or some of these issues. Climate change is coming. Irrefutably. We can predict changes over the next 10 years in parts of the world that are important to the U.S. national security, where stability is already threatened, where governments are strained or failing. How do we address those? And the answer is, quite often, with great difficulty. Typically, environmental issues are considered last. Apply Maslow's hierarchy of needs to a developing country and its efforts to meet the needs of the people. Can it provide food and shelter? Do we have health and physical security? If not, how do you think in terms of economic growth where only 15% of the people may be employed in the formal sector? And the feeling of nationalism. David and I were talking last night about 6 o'clock about the nationalism as an issue in Africa. And which countries could be called nation states had achieved that feeling of being Zairewa or Congolese and not Bemba or Shona or Ndebele. So environmental concerns are typically addressed last, when in fact they are essential to success in addressing each one of those issues as one moves up that hierarchy of needs. And increasingly we have recognized that, and then the question is, how do you use all elements of power to achieve this? Because as the Sustainable Development Model demonstrates, sustainable means that you have focused on the environmental issues, not just the economic issues, and that they are equitably distributed across all parts of the country. As Jeff described, how water can and has led to conflict intrastate because of a particular part of a country that feels disenfranchised from the largesse that's developed by the government. And I would argue that the military has a very strong role in helping to address that at minimal cost. Quite often developing countries will have unusually large militaries that are able to determine the longevity of a government. That's why they haven't been downsized, at least in part. 40,000 man army left over from the Cold War era. Reduce the size of that military at your own risk. How do we get them to use their good communications, their presence on the frontier? And ask yourself, those of you who are familiar with developing countries, how large is their Ministry of the Environment or Energy or Interior? And what kind of resources do they have? Can they even drive to the frontier, much less having a presence? But you can have the military out there monitoring diseases as they come across, not just the transmission of contraband. That they could be telling you when you have water issues that need to be addressed. And so this has been recognized. Our own DOD in the early 1990s was given by Congress $21 million to address non-lethal uses of the military in Africa. And these are some of the projects that resulted from that. I was a defense attaché in Malawi at one time. When I arrived in country, the day I got there, 20,000 refugees came over fleeing the drought and war in Mozambique. And the question is, well, how do we settle them? How do we meet their needs? How do we differentiate between the relatively well taken care of refugees and the host nation people that don't have the blue tarp, the guaranteed food, the roof over their head necessarily? And how do we maintain governmental legitimacy? When I left country 2 years later, we had 700,000 refugees, 10% of the population equivalent living in Malawi, and the same questions remained. the same questions remain. So the military became involved in helping with this because you might have a small group of refugees, let's say 10,000, where 2 or 3 children a night were dying of dysentery because they didn't have clean water, and the military could come in and drive a borehole at a simple level. Or we could try to get grain into Mozambique in insecure areas, and the military would be essential at providing security on the train, distributing the resources later on, finding welders to weld the steel that we got from Zimbabwe to put on the locos to go down the Nacala rail line and deliver that grain from the World Food Program. So the problem, of course, with the military is cross-cultural communication. They have to learn to deal with their own agencies internally. I argue to say that the United States, our military struggles today to talk between Army and Navy, or between, what is that article we saw, state is from Venus and defense is from Mars. Do we speak the same language? And then take that overseas where people don't join the military to distribute food. So it's a constant problem, but it's essential because in times of emergency, the military will be called upon. So in countries that have a bad human rights record and a bad military human rights record, such as the Philippines under Marcos, the military under Fidel Ramos developed an approach where it said we will support civil authority, not at just attacking insurgents on Mindanao, but at helping to cut the roots of insurgency by addressing those, and many are environmental security issues, land degradation, water abuse, a maldistribution of resources between urban dwellers and the elite, and other religious groups such as the Muslims down on Mindanao. So the military was quite successful in doing that. They developed a stewardship program. They took one of their officers, a Harvard graduate, and sent him to Mindanao with a brigade to reconstitute rainforests. And it's not something that's just to turn off conflict, as has been done on Holo Island and Basilan Island and now Mindanao, but it's also being used by countries that are dealing with climate change issues to build good legitimacy with the people. This is Mexico, where they have 46 military forest nurseries. I got these facts from a student of mine at the War College. Planting trees, the PLA has done reforestation for millions of trees and worked with civil authority to do it in China, and has demonstrated a willingness to work with other countries in the region. And so it comes down to this. If we recognize environmental issues as a factor in regional stability, we can use them to build confidence in communication between countries that may already be struggling over territory. Or we can leave these issues untended until they become issues in elements of conflict such as we've seen in Kenya. And it's important, I think, that we use all viable resources to do it, such as the U.S. military, by encouraging, not doing it themselves rarely, but to encourage host nation militaries to assume this role in support civil authority in addressing the needs of the people and maintaining legitimacy. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak.
Jeff is going to moderate the question and answer since he's familiar with many of them. I just want to see if I can pull up that video that should have been embedded